This book burning, lungs floating to sky, the feathers foaming, the lungs launching to abyss, to sky. This serpent of fire soaks the bones with sky, with ash. The son of sky sings my skull with light. The roots radiate with roses, the fire floating, the lungs dancing to skull, the lungs floating to sun, the sleeping shadows soaked with sun, the skull singing its son of sky. The sun floats our skulls to dream, radiates the sky, floats seaward, salt, skull, cloud. My shadow sleeps in my skull, this shadow of abyss. The sun sings, the sky sleeping with stars, the sky sleeping with stars. Death launching to void, the lightning in the veins floating to lungs, the sky floating salt skulls of foam, the sun sweating in the skull, the sun sweating in the skull, the fire soaking our skulls, illusions are ash, death singing the sun, light foaming the face, death the transition to a different level of consciousness, God's diamond of fire and divine light, sleeping the mask of machetes, ash to blackbirds of abyss, the mirror of machetes, ashes to sun, my hands of fire lighting away, my hands of fire floating to space, fingers of foam, the eggs of light developing in skull, in lung, in infinity, the eyes of fire foaming with ash, the midnight black, cool with ash, with moon, the sun soaking our skulls with sun, with sleep, the axe of anxiety, ashes to abyss, the sky floats to sun, my heart sleeping in the unknown, a rose of flame, fragments of stars lighting the pen of fire, floating to space, feathers floating space, to skulls singing, the fire coral black as abyss, ink swimming in night oil of abyss, inside the waves dancing, the feathers of sea floating to sky, the womb of stars blossoming from mouths, the feathers foaming, the sun of dreams singing, the smoke, this book of blood burning in my chest, a heart blazing sun, the constellations of ivory stars singing, the feather of sun singing to sun, the lungs float, launch and sing, the sun sing, wings floating on eggs of eternity, nests of the nations, nerves of sky and freedom, foaming to feather, vultures vanishing, visions voyaging the veins, skulls sailing to moon, circular light, sun sailing infinity, the skull dreaming the skull to sleep, the silence sleeping in my skull, sleeps now in my skin, breasts of milk foaming the waves, floating in space, foaming to stars, breasts foaming with fire, breasts foaming with sky, a breast of flames foaming to sky, teeth foaming stars, the air listening to infinity, vultures vanishing, the veins voyaging visions, satellites sailing in the skin, arteries anchoring the air, skulls sailing the sky, seeding the sun with fire, the bird of light floating on ink, foam feathering the air with sun, stars singing to light, the bird of ash inking abyss, singing the air, singing the sun sweating in my skull, the shadows sleeping to ash, the silence sings the sun, the mask of machetes ashing, transforming to black feathers, blackbirds floating on wind, on air, sleeping in infinity's nest of thunder, shadow the eggs of eternity, thundering to clouds, a head of foam and fire clouding air, foaming the lungs with lightning, a throat of light sings the sun, the lion larynx of thunder, the dancing serpent of wisdom of pearls, the foam focusing, the shadow swims, the light floats, the light feasts, the sun sweating in my skull, sleeping, shadow of wombs of life source, of light source, the sun sweating in my skull, the roses in my blood radiating the roots, the dove of lightning igniting the clouds to invisible hands, the skull of sky singing the roots, foaming feathers to ash, feather foaming with focus. The silence sings to my skull sings to sun. The fire floats, the fire foams in skulls. The light floats, the light feasts. The feather of focus drinks the air. This book burns, drinks fire. The feathers floating to abyss, on flame, on ink of ash. Coral night, the feathers foaming with sky clouds in floating sail. The fire floating sings to sun, sings to night, moon yellow jaw, fangs are ash. The paper plane floating to sky, dancing light, ash, ash, ash. Amnesia ashes, the airport of amnesia ashes. Airports aviating the arteries, the mirrors of water vanishing in shadow, blackbirds of ink singing the moon. My father's eyes are black flames of coral knowledge, loving the journey. My mother's eyes are earth of roots, sustaining nourishment of love. The salt in the clouds dancing, the maps of cosmos, the fins foaming breeze, the womb blossoming stars, the sea singing to sky, a serpent of fire, sprouts wings of flame, a pen of fire foaming, sky and lightning. I am born in a storm, I am born in a storm. The storms are ash, I am birthed in light, in God's cosmic freedom of imagination and spirit. The fires foaming through my fingers, the fires foaming ash. The fires floating in our lungs, wings of sun sleeping in shadow, under skull shade, the serpent of light soaking sky with sun, the sky singing to lungs, the abyss, the light, vultures vanishing, visions voyaging the veins, the mirrors flashing water, the feathers floating on abyss, flying, flying, flying air, the lungs swimming in sky, sailing, the feathers floating through my heart singing sea, sea flying air, air, the feathers of lightning, drinking my hands of salt, drinking my hands to sleep, sleeping my hands to light, the fires floating in the lungs, sky sleeping in my skull, skull sleeping in sky, shining, shining to star, to salt, floating ignites the universe to flame, the distance, the darkness black as midnight oil, coral, black flame, the fire sleeping the lightning, to sky, to skull, to sun, the petals of fire foaming ink, our skin singing with sun. I drink coffee, my sleep is a bliss, blackness, coral, foam, the sun singing its flame, wings to sleep, my skull singing in sky, the womb singing in light, flaming, flaming me to sleep, the skull, the silence, the flame, naked and standing in forever freedom of God's divine will, the long sailing shadows, the shadows sleeping in my skull, the sea feathers floating to abyss, to sky lungs, swimming to skulls, dry with shadow, the feathers floating to sky, burning paper, sparks of sun, drinking my lungs, feathers of foam, sucking the sun's skull of fire, the sky sleeping in sun, sucking the wind, my lungs launched to light, 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 feathers foaming in the face, the foam igniting to ivory clouds, the lightning invisible, the thunder loud, feathers foaming into feathers, the feathers floating inside my lungs of liberty, the air drinking air, the sky floating in my skull, the petals of flame of ash, singing my heart, the bird of fire floating on wings of ash, the sky dancing in the sun, the chains are ash, this pen of fire igniting the clouds, the wings of birds blank with abyss, the paper still as sun, blank as cloud, the feathers floating through sky, the dove of lightning singing to sky, to paper, to salt, floating foam, the dove of lightning dancing to sky, floating to lungs, foaming clouds, foaming salt, foaming foam, vultures vanishing, the veins voyaging, arteries anchoring the airports of air sailing, the sun spinning in the spine, soaking our skulls with shadow, the fire in our hair flaming, my hands with light, feathers floating in the lungs dancing through sky, dreaming the hands of light. The shadows sleep in my skull, the sun sleeps in my spine, the lightning dances in lungs, the thunder echoes the silence sleeps in shadow, the flowers flame to ash, feathers foaming in the womb, birds of abyss, choral night dancing between stone and cloud, the fire floats, the throat on fire, singing its sky, the fire floating, the feathers flying to sky, to focus, the desert dreams the sun, the matets turn to ashes, black butterflies of abyss, floating birds of ash, choral singing, a throat of sun thundering, a larynx of lightning launching to sun, the fires foaming, the ash floating through my pupils of coral oil, the feathers floating through ash, the journey floating through ash, vultures vanishing, jaguars dancing, the feathers floating to ash, to silent flame, the hurricane sleeping in stones, the womb sings in light, this foaming, floating cloud to lightning, the feathers flaming, foaming the skull in sound, orbiting sea, orbiting oblivion, orbiting oceans, the shadows vanishing, light, 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 the shadows of veins flaming to ash, the lungs floating to lightning, the sun's songs dance to light, the feathers floating, the fire floating in my eyes ignites the cloud of lungs, the lungs of clouds are clouds sleeping, in my lungs launch to light, sails navigating abyss, traveling universe, light blossoming from your forehead of sky, the storm singing, my lungs salt of clouds, floating, floating, a feather of sun foaming, choral night, the sky floating on stones, singing the feathers floating, a light feast, a feather foaming, the feathers foaming to ash, the feathers floating to abyss, the serpents sleeping in my skull, biting their tails, singing my hands to light, the feathers floating, a light feast floating, foaming to skull, to lung, a feather foaming to sky, the feathers foaming to ash, a larynx launched to light, the feathers foaming, a shadow of ash sings abyss, the whispers of water, wisdom in your womb, the sun singing silence, the feathers foaming, my fingers of fire, butterflies blooming in my bones, the light burning sky, the roses ash to ink, drinking night coral abyss, the ash of shadow, visions voyaging the veins, foaming my fingernails with salt, ash inking sky, my teeth a fire of stars, light feast, light feast, light feast, a spine of sun sings to the pearls of focus, the roses radiant in the roots, my lungs lighting sky, stars dancing the skulls to salt, the cloud, the sun a flaming breast, the pearl of infinity foaming sky, larynx launch a light, light feast drinking my lungs with pearls of salt, my larynx launch a light, light feast dance, light feast sky, light feast freedom of God's divine will of infinite fire, light feast.